Well, welcome everybody. This is the fourth webinar in our Connect the Heartland series. I'm Kelly Bargman. I am the Programs and Outreach Manager for Heartland Rewilding, which is an initiative between Project Coyote and the Rewilding Institute. We at Heartland Rewilding envision a thriving Midwestern landscape where people and wild nature flourish. And so to that end, we work across the Mississippi River Wildshed, working to rewild and reconnect wild lands, wildlife, and people. So we are here today to learn about bison and rewilding. We have a wonderful speaker with us today. We have Scott Heidebrink from American Prairie. He heads up their bison stuff. So he is going to be talking about ecological role of bison and how they're some of our best rewilders. So I don't want to take too long. So without further ado, Scott, the floor is yours, so to speak.
All right, having some technical difficulties here. Give me a sec.
While Scott's working on that, I'll just take a moment to remind people you're welcome to post any questions throughout the webinar into our Q&A function. That's where I'm going to try and pull some of the questions for our Q&A session at the end from. I will also try, if there's some in the chat, to pull those, but the Q&A makes it a lot easier for us to do that, so please pop them in there. And we hope to have plenty of time to have our Q&A, but if we don't answer any of your questions live, we will be doing a follow-up blog, and everyone who is registered, whether you're attending or not today, will be able to access this recording sometime next week. We will send it out. I will try to BCC you all in an email, send that out. It'll also be on Heartland Rewilding socials, and as well as our YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Heartland Rewilding. If you want to subscribe, you will get a notification and be the first to know the minute that this webinar is posted there, as well as all of our other wonderful videos. It looks like Scott's got this going. So Scott, are you still there? Can we hear you?
Yes. All right.
All righty. All right.
Thank you.
Let's get this started.
Yeah, thank you for dealing with my lack of technological ability. I like to work with bison. So I'm going to start. Yeah, I'm Scott Heidebrink. I'm the Director of Bison Restoration for American Prairie. My background is I'm actually from Iowa originally. I did tallgrass prairie restoration, and I've worked in a lot of recreation areas over the years, and eventually found my way out here to Montana and ended up working with bison. So today I'll tell you a little bit about, do a quick overview of American Prairie, our bison program, and then how that fits into rewilding and all the cool ecological stuff that bison do on the landscape. So American Prairie is located, we're a conservation organization located in the northern Great Plains of Montana. We primarily focus on lands around the Charles M. Russell Wildlife Refuge and the Upper Missouri Breaks National Monument along through the Missouri River corridor here. And our model is using private philanthropy to buy deeded lands to connect existing public lands with the goal of reintroducing species, increasing biodiversity, and seeing a fully intact grassland ecosystem preserved for all the wildlife, flora, fauna, and people to enjoy. With this, we use a model of buying public land, or buying private land, like I said, and then acquiring public land leases. And this is where we primarily do our restoration work. We also work with some neighboring ranchers in the region as well. But as you can see on this map, the dark blue and the light blue are American Prairie managed lands. And when a ranch comes up for sale, which would be the white on the map, is private land, we try to buy it to connect our properties, to connect to that public land and create a seamless landscape for this ecosystem to thrive. And how do we focus our time and energy, our resources to make the biggest difference on this landscape? And in rewilding, we have come to learn that there are a few species that can impact the whole ecosystem, improve things for many other species. So up here on the prairie, we have 3 primary ecosystem engineers. And so we focus our time and energy on prairie dogs, beavers, and bison. If we focus on those 3 and do a great job restoring those, we can impact hundreds of other species and thousands of other acres. So I'll just give a quick overview of prairie dogs. As we know, they burrow, they live in large colonies, they are a heavy grazer, and so they alter the ecosystem in a way that no other species does out here on the prairie. And so we're focused on growing our prairie dog populations to benefit all the ground nesting birds that use the area, the plants that flourish in that heavily grazed system, and then also all those animals that eat prairie dogs, from coyotes to hawks to eagles. Everything loves to eat prairie dogs. The next, beaver restoration. We have a lot of streams here that have been degraded. And if we can get beavers back into the system and get those streams revegetated with woody vegetation as they historically would have, we can really get these migratory birds a better place to move through, where they're more protected. It gives shelter for other species in the winter, such as sharp-tailed grouse, and any number of animals use these riparian corridors that beavers really accentuate. They use these to move across the landscape in more of a hidden way. So we do a lot of things like put beaver dam analogs in to begin the revegetation process, with the plan that all these things will, the woody vegetation will be there when the beavers arrive, and then the beavers do the rest of the work for us, which is great. And then where my focus lies is on our bison restoration program. And we really primarily, we chose bison because of the ecosystem engineer function, but also it's one of the animals that we have control over, because in Montana they are classified as livestock. So we can manage them and get them on the landscape much quicker as a private entity owning private livestock. And so in 2005, we began our bison program by importing 16 bison. So we started small. I believe it was on 80 acres. And over the past 15 years or so, we have grown to about 800 bison. We should be approaching 1,000 by next year. And we have those bison in 2 herds. And our primary goal is to really let them function on large landscapes in the ways that they would have interacted with the landscape, with people, and with the other wildlife in the region historically. And so we're looking at this through the lens of benefiting bison conservation across North America. We want people to be educated about these bison. We want to see those big changes on the landscape. We partner with our tribal neighbors from a cultural aspect. And then we have the wildlife viewing and other recreational opportunities that come with bison. And the biggest thing is those ecological benefits. And there are tons of them, which is what we're mostly going to focus on today. So with our bison program, we know there are a lot of interactions. Here's a small herd on the landscape. What we know historically is that there were millions and millions of bison. And we what was 150 years ago, what we saw was a steep decline in numbers from, let's say, 30 million down to less than 1,000 within 30 years. And we really don't know. We know bison impacted the landscape in a big way, but there was no research happening back then. So there's a lot of missing pieces to this puzzle of what this plains ecosystem looked like with 30 million bison on it. We don't know the impact, nor do I think we can even fathom the impact until we actually restore these bison and see these changes occurring over the decades. The way we look at this is like a puzzle. So looking at this landscape in this picture right here, we are missing a lot of things in this picture. Most of them we couldn't even see in this picture though. So the bison are the obvious piece missing here. But when you think of this as a puzzle, this whole prairie ecosystem, and you have deer and you have flowers and you have birds and everything's a puzzle piece. The bison hold a lot of puzzle pieces, but we don't actually know what's on those puzzle pieces yet. But we do know that if we put them back on the landscape in a meaningful, impactful way, and let bison do what they historically would have, we start to see those puzzle pieces and the picture starts to appear. And we're slowly learning over the decades what ecological changes and benefits these bison had on the landscape as they return. So there's a ton of interactions happening on our landscape, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this. I wish I knew them all. We're learning every day, but a few of them, are, they're grazing, things that happen in the winter, all their hooves, things happening with trees on the landscape, wallowing, urine, scat, and mortality on the landscape are all a few of these things that are now once again happening on the landscape. So I'm kind of going to go through some of the benefits we're seeing on the landscape one by one here and tell you a little bit about what we've learned and why and what this is impacting, like who and what is impacted on the landscape. So I'm going to start with a video here. This is just one group of bison moving across the landscape. And I'm going to pause here for a second. As we see, these bison are moving in a fairly tight group. They're not widespread. And if you can imagine this times 1,000, this could have been a herd of 30,000 bison 150 years ago. And now it's a herd of, this is probably 50 bison here. Think about all the hoof action that would have taken place on this landscape. And we're seeing it in a small scale here, but you're getting a trampling effect. You're getting pock marks in the soil. They are breaking up mosses and lichens that are on the soil that without this heavy action would become thick enough on the landscape that no grasses could grow through it, no forbs could come up. And so what we see here with these groups of bison in tighter formations moving across the landscape is that things are opening up. You're giving opportunities for plants, mostly smaller flowers like asters, sago lilies, and other smaller plants to flourish, pop up. They get that light because the vegetation is trampled, that moss layer is broke up, and all those pock marks in the soil, those little divots, also collect more water and less water is running off. So everything from grasses to plants is improved, even though they're getting trampled. Over time, we're seeing things improve. And I'll finish letting you enjoy the sunset here before we move on to the next slide. All right, so the biggest change that we see with grazing and switching from cattle management to bison management on our allotments is the heterogeneity on the landscape. And this is important for a great number of reasons, but birds are the species, different species of birds respond very quickly to changes in grazing patterns. And what we see in the bison pastures is instead of seeing a uniform kind of take half the grass, leave half the grass system, what we're seeing is by letting bison move around large landscapes. So our one bison pasture is 27,000 acres, and bison have access year round to the whole entire thing. And what we've started seeing as our numbers have grown, this herd is about 450 bison. What we see is this patchwork of grasses starting across the landscape. Some is grazed very short, like on the left side of the graph here, to where it's very short or almost bare soil, especially along prairie dog towns. We see areas of moderate grazing, and then we see areas of almost no grazing. And we have many of these species present on the landscape, and what we're seeing is as we increase this heterogeneity, we are seeing things like Bayard sparrows that require fairly dense grass returning to nest because the bison are moving enough and skipping parts of the landscape that they might not hit a certain area of 10, 20, or even 100 acres in 2 years. And so we see these thick grass patches coming back where Sprague's pipits and Bayard sparrows are nesting again. And then we see the opposite also happening, like with the mountain plover at the left end of the spectrum there, where we have certain areas where bison graze fairly heavily every year, and the grass will maybe only be an inch or two tall and year round because they continually graze it. And that's allowing things like the long spurs and the mountain plovers to also nest in these large open areas where they prefer to use their camouflage to conceal their eggs rather than hiding them in thick brush. And so that's one thing we've seen is bird diversity changing. And then another really cool impact that we're seeing is on conifer encroachment. We don't have conifer encroachment near as badly as some places further east of here that get more moisture, but what we are seeing is the encroachment we do have is decreasing where we have bison. And we've had bison in some of these areas for anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And what we're seeing is this happening. The tree on the right, within 10 years of bison grazing, is dead. The picture on the left there is actually from Yellowstone National Park of a tree becoming girdled by a bison. This is extremely important for us, mainly because of sage grouse, which are a species of concern, and they will not nest anywhere near vertical structure. And so one thing we haven't researched yet, but think is happening on the landscape is we're improving sage grouse nesting habitat, therefore increasing the amount of acres available for them by having these trees removed. And the best thing about it is it's passive. We spend no money removing those trees. We have no equipment on the landscape, very little disturbance, and the bison are doing it for us. So it's really, I would say our conifer encroachment anecdotally has been reduced by about 50% in 15 years. So it does make a very big impact. The other area with vegetation where we're seeing changes are in riparian areas. The cool thing about bison is they are very well adapted to the plains ecosystem, which can be extremely hot. Cattle, on the other hand, are a different species from a different part of the world where they evolved with cooler and wetter temperatures. And so, cooler temperatures and wetter conditions. And what we see in our region is that once we hit midsummer and the highs are regularly above 90 degrees, cattle tend to stick to water in riparian areas. And over time, these areas can become degraded through trampling and the amount of time that is spent grazing there. What we're seeing with bison is the bison are not feeling heat stress. This has been researched until about 92 degrees. So they need no extra shade, no extra water until they get to that point. And cattle are feeling that in the low 80s. And there's a lot of days in our region above 80 degrees. And so by putting bison back on the landscape, what we're seeing is vast improvements in vegetation and revegetation of degraded streams. And so we're seeing, within 5 years, we're seeing cattails, sedges, and maybe even a few willows returning with no assistance. This is all passive again. And, what we're seeing in other areas too is that we think what's going to happen, we've only had bison for about 15 years. And so we think if we give it another 15 years, we're going to start seeing the willows return even heavier, the cottonwoods return, the box elder trees returning, and really revegetating these areas. And we've been doing a lot of research on this, or I shouldn't say American Prairie has now. We have a partnership with the Smithsonian Institute. They have researchers on the ground. Also, several universities have been looking at this diversity, especially in riparian areas. And what we're seeing is with bison, because of the lower amount of time they're spending in riparian areas, they're in and out for water. And then they get back upland. What we're seeing is the species diversity in these riparian zones is about twice what it is before having bison. And the vegetation height of woody vegetation is about twice as high as it would be in cattle graze pastures. And so this is benefiting small mammals, but especially birds. That's where we're seeing the biggest changes. So now we're going to move to a different season, and this is my favorite, where bison, I think, do some of the coolest things on the landscape. And it's real simple. They are built for the cold weather, 10,000 hairs per square inch in the winter. All that body mass up front, that thick fur keeps them super warm so they can hang out and eat the grass that's buried under the snow. And that's why they have this giant head and neck, is to swipe their head side to side and remove snow and get down to that grass. When they do this, however, they're not eating everything that they uncover. And so there's other species that are going to benefit from them moving all this snow. We have a lot of pronghorn, and we have a pronghorn up to 400-mile long pronghorn migration that moves through the region our bison are in. And we have not studied this yet, but I have watched pronghorn follow bison as they graze. The bison are opening these places up in the winter by clearing snow. Pronghorn can't dig. They don't have the head for it. They don't have the feet for it. And so any little thing that can make their life easier is going to improve survivability and therefore increase pronghorn populations in the region. And so we see this with mule deer as well. They will follow the bison around, eating what's left in those cleared off areas. And when I say cleared off area, when a bison herd goes through an area, if let's say it's 200 bison, they're going to clear a swath. And I shouldn't say clear, they're going to mound up snow and clear off patches, about the size of a small kitchen table. And it looks like a bunch of people went through with shovels, like 1,000 people had shovels and just made little piles of snow and cleared off little spots. And it when 200 bison do this, it just opens up a ton of food for other species too. Birds are another great example. I've watched sage grouse, follow them around on the ground. You see tons of horned larks and buntings and other small birds that winter here in northern Montana, also following them around throughout the winter to pick up seeds and other things left behind after the grazing. And then following winter, we get this great flush of bison hair everywhere. And what we've been noticing is we are finding this bison hair in a lot of nests, bird nests, and especially small mammal and rodent nests like voles and mice. And I can't imagine what kind of benefits this provides for these birds and mammals. The insulative value alone has to improve survivability. And so what we see is all these nests, and with these things in, all this hair spread across the landscape. The other thing it's doing is spreading seeds across the landscape. Bison are great collectors of stuff in their fur. And so wherever there is bison fur left, there's going to be seeds that went with it. And so this is another way that plants can get moved around the landscape into places they may have not been always present. I think it's unfathomable to think how much hair and wool, this bison wool, would be on the landscape if there was 10,000 bison in a herd. It would just be astronomical, the amount of stuff getting spread across this landscape. The next behavior I'm going to talk about, one that makes big differences and has been research has really been building, is wallowing. So I'm going to play a video here of a bison wallowing. And if you notice, pretty quick from the beginning, you'll see some hair flying off. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. So bison are wallowing for a number of reasons. This guy, I'm fairly confident, was wallowing because he was itchy and trying to get all that winter coat off of him. The other reasons they'll do it, bulls will do it as a show of dominance. And they'll also do it a lot to cover themselves in dust, give dust baths. It helps a lot with insects, mosquitoes, flies, things like that. And I guess we're going to watch this again for a sec. There we go. All right. And so wallows are taking place all over the landscape. This is an aerial image of about 5 acres of our bison pasture near creek. And the 4 red arrows there are all wallows. So in 5 acres, we got 4 wallows here. So you take that, add that up across the landscape, multiply it, you're going to probably end up with 1,000 wallowing areas across our bison pasture. What we're seeing with the research with this is there is a difference in plant diversity next to wallows and near wallows. It's much higher. There's a lot, the species richness is higher. So we're seeing plants that are not found in the immediate area showing up around these wallows. And it makes perfect sense with that Velcro fur full of seeds. They're shedding it while they're wallowing, and it's getting left behind on the landscape. And it's also a place that's going to be generally a little wetter, and it's going to be more open. So those plants have an opportunity to also germinate because of the openness of the areas around the edge of the wallow. The other thing we're seeing is we are finding some bee species, and I don't have the exact names or the species of bee, but that are nesting in wallows, ground nesting bees. What we're seeing is some species that were in very low densities across the landscape actually increasing because they're finding places to nest in these open areas like bison wallows, which is not something we expected. And then the next interaction I'm going to talk about is one of my favorites. We'll just call it nutrient movement of nutrients. How about that? With this, what we're seeing is when you add tons of bison to a landscape, they have tons of scat and they have tons of urine, and those things are full of nutrients. The scat is full of seeds, and what we're seeing is migration of nutrients. And so they may be eating on one part of the pasture and then walking a mile to another part. They're moving that nutrients that they took from the grass they ate, digested, and then excreting it elsewhere on the landscape. And so if you look kind of around this bison paddy here, you'll see there's not a lot of vegetation. This is an area where the soil's not great. It's very rocky. But as bison continue to move through these areas, they're not going to spend a ton of time there because there's not a lot to graze. But they're leaving behind things like this that over time, at the right densities, we think we will see improvements in nutrients in the soil, grasses showing back up, things like that. It's been seen in production herds. By intensively grazing bison, you can improve soil conditions, rangeland conditions. And so we also are seeing that in portions of our bison pastures. And there's one more way that bison move nutrients around the soil. Fair warning, this is a little more graphic of a slide. I'm going to talk about, we call it fate of ungulate production, which means mortality in bison, which has been missing from the landscape for well over 150 years. If you can imagine 30 million bison, there are going to be tens of thousands of bison dying a year. And the amount of nutrients that alone would put back into an ecosystem is unfathomable. And what we're seeing is, or I guess to start out with our management, we do not intervene in our bison's health unless it is something human caused. So if they contract pneumonia out on the landscape, they contract pneumonia. If they are wounded during a fight with each other, they either have to heal from that or they will succumb to their injury. And then we are not removing carcasses from the landscape. And so what we're seeing is huge benefits to all these scavengers. We have a ton of scavengers. It took coyotes almost 10 years to really begin to figure out how to effectively get into a bison carcass and consume it. Because the hide is so thick, they had trouble with it. And now our bison carcasses are consumed in a matter of a week. If in the past it would take bison well over 2 to 3 weeks, if ever, to get into a bison carcass and fully consume it. We have a ton of eagles, hawks, and scavengers like magpies, vultures that are also benefiting from the bison dying on the landscape once again. What we see around these areas is we see another way plants get moved around the landscape because of all that fur again, collecting seeds. We see different plants showing up around bison carcasses. The other thing we see is the years following the death of a bison, The first year looks like that photo kind of in the center there, a big dead patch, a bunch of scattered fir and bones. Year 2, we start to see some revegetation. Year 3, the vegetation is often 2 to 3 times taller than and more dense than what was previously there or what is in the immediate area. So what we think over time is that as more bison die on the landscape, as this becomes more common, is we're going to see that those soil nutrients, those improvements in the rangeland continue to improve over time. So what the few things I've shared with you here are some of the bigger interactions, the ones we really know about. The struggle with bison and the impacts on landscape is there is no great data from the past. We have no frame of reference because this happened 150 years ago. Nobody was keeping records of all these interactions. Science was not a priority when we expanded west. And so we have a ton of questions to answer. And in my opinion, there is so much to learn about bison and the interactions that will take place on the landscape that we need to continue to have these big landscape sized projects, reintroducing these important species, seeing what interactions are happening, but then also researching them, learning from them, and just getting a baseline for what is actually going to happen out on these landscapes as we reintroduce these large ungulates. My hope is that someday we will have large enough landscapes with large enough populations that we can see the true interaction of plants, animals, people, lichens, even mosses, trees, all of these different things, all those puzzle pieces come back together, and we can really see what that fully functioning, that function word, what is that? We hope at American Prairie we can see that on the landscape. We're starting to see it through little bits of like the pieces I talked about, but we have a lot more to learn and explore and see as we grow these landscapes and grow these populations. So with that, I am more than happy to answer a whole lot of questions. And my contact info is there. I'm open for questions anytime, anywhere. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kelly.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Why don't we leave this slide up?
Okay.
Leave that last slide up, just in case people have, want to get that down a little bit.
Yep.
And I don't know. I think it's better than looking at 2 people answering questions. All your beautiful bison images. Keep posting questions in the Q&A, people. And I've got somebody behind the scenes who's going to keep pulling those. Just a reminder again, we've already got quite a few. And so if we don't get to all the questions today, which we often don't, even when we've got, 15 minutes or so, we will be collecting those and saving them. And then we will have a follow-up blog to come. And that will be shared in an email to everyone who registered for this webinar, as well as the recording to this webinar. If you do want to get that recording sooner, because that's probably going to come out before the blog, you can go to YouTube and search for us at Heartland Rewilding and subscribe to our channel. That will send you a notification as soon as I have uploaded that recording. But again, I will be emailing that out and with the blog as soon as both of those are ready for sharing. All right. You ready for some questions, Scott?
Let's do it.
All right. So you touched on this a little bit, but we had several people ask to go a little more in depth on the differences between the effects that bison versus domesticated cattle have on the landscape. specifically Jay had asked, like, how is the cattle trampling on the prairie worse than the bison doing so?
So I'll start with trampling. So from the perspective of how they graze, we're talking just across the landscape. The differences are that the general trampling that takes place while movement is taking place, so a herd is moving across the landscape, bison tend to stay in those tighter groups, and that trampling effect is more compressed, whereas cattle generally stay out in our landscape are staying a little more spread out, and so you're not getting that intense trampling, which doesn't open up the soil surface and all those benefits I talked about as well. If we're talking about trampling in a riparian area, that's where we don't want a ton of trampling. And so the bison are trampling less in the riparian areas because they are spending a significantly lower amount of time there. And so what we're seeing is bison will move further from water, and they will also spend less time at that water when they are there. So they get a drink, and they get back upland and go back to grazing, hanging out on the hilltops in the sun. What cattle we're seeing are spending way more time in those areas, and as a result, trampling takes place. Not because they're doing anything wrong, just because of the amount of time they're spending there. So that's the big difference.
Great, thanks. Joe asked, what is your target herd size, and are your bison hybrids?
So we have a few criteria we've set for our bison program. We set a goal of not managing any herds smaller than 400. And we want to do it on as large of landscapes as possible. So right now we have two herds that are, one, the max is about 450, the other one is about 550. And if we start any new herds, they will be over 1,000 bison. They will be on properties that can maintain a population of over 1,000. And that's mainly for genetics and then all those ecological benefits. But we have a goal of our goals state that we will manage up to 6,000 bison. If the state of Montana would decide to make them wildlife, that changes this conversation drastically. But for now, as livestock, managed in as natural a way as possible, we would manage up to 6,000 bison, but we are a little ways away from that.
And are they hybrids? Did you source, like, where did you source the bison that you're introducing to your herds from?
Right. So there's actually some new research out. The genetic testing keeps getting better for bison. They recently sequenced the genome, and what they have found is there are minute amounts of cattle genes in bison samples from herds that were previously thought to be free of cattle genes. So they have found them in the Yellowstone herd. They have found these tiny bits in the Elk Island herds in Canada, and a few others. And so what that basically means is it would be a needle in a haystack to find a guaranteed 100% pure bison. However, these cattle genes and this integration is so minute, as far as we can tell, and research is showing, like, there is no negative effect on bison. Do we want to make efforts to reduce that or not increase cattle gene integration? Of course. But as of right now, technically, science is saying there is no pure bison, but from a management standpoint, a bison is a bison is a bison. And as far as sourcing, we have sourced bison from Elk Island National Park in Canada, Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, and from some of our tribal neighbors, which have Yellowstone lineage.
Interesting. Speaking of local tribes, we had a couple people asking about relationships or interaction supports to and from Indigenous communities. Specifically, Todd mentioned that he works with folks at the Intertribal Buffalo Council. And so they're just wondering a little bit about how you work with local tribes and what the support in your area is like.
Yeah, so we have great relationships with our tribal neighbors here in Montana. There are 3 tribal nations within a couple hours of our area. We have relationships with all of them. Most of those relationships have started 15 years ago through Bison. It's a big commonality for us, but though they have strengthened over time. You know, we have friends, colleagues, we partner on a lot of things. We partner on bison management. We trade bison for genetic purposes. You know, we'll go to powwows. We'll all kinds of things. We celebrate things together. If we start a new bison herd, oftentimes some of our tribal friends will come down and we'll have a big ceremony, a big celebration. Also, we with Intertribal Buffalo Council, we have a great relationship with them and partner with them. I believe to date we have distributed over 500 bison to tribal and conservation herds. I think about 400 of those bison have been to tribal herds, and so we're trying to help other herds with genetics or help folks get new conservation herds started. And so recently the Rocky Boy tribe, which is one of our neighbors up here, they wanted to reintroduce bison. We brought them 6 bison to start, and we had a big celebration. And yeah, we just have great relationships, a lot of commonalities.
Wonderful. We're Heartland Rewilding and all of our groups, we're all about building coalitions, so love that.
For sure.
Violet asked, are the areas with bison open to the public? And if so, do you see any tourist effects?
Yes, all of our lands, almost all of our lands are open to public. We have a few small areas that we are refugia for wildlife that we don't allow access to, but largely we manage about 450,000 acres, and over 400,000 of that is open to the public. The bison are on about 37,000 acres. Those areas are also open to the public. Our bison in general, everyone sees Yellowstone bison acting like Yellowstone bison do, with people getting very close, them really not minding people. Our bison are not like that. They're not habituated really at all. Our bison, if you're too close, they move off. They go find another part of the property. And especially when they have calves, they are going to get in the deepest coulees, the most hidden spots where people can't find them. So what we see, I think, is a more accurate depiction probably of what bison historically did when they were disturbed, whether that be a wolf, a grizzly bear, or a person.
A couple more questions here. We got a little under 5 or a little over 5 minutes left. Inez asked, are you studying the effect of wildlife on the carbon cycle? How are animals helping ecosystems absorb more carbon from the atmosphere?
Yes. So the short answer would be, I don't know how they are, what the changes are, how they're impacting that. We are starting a project this summer with carbon storage and trying to develop protocols in a project around this, but we are definitely behind the 8 ball on that area.
I'll add from our own work, prairies are grasslands are some of the best carbon sinks out there. And so I'd imagine that the more, as Scott was saying, when you have these ecosystem engineers on the landscape, you see a greater diversity. And the greater diversity in our grasslands, the greater biodiversity we see, science is showing that leads to greater storage and capture of carbon. So Scott, I'm really interested to see what the results of some of those studies are, and if they support some of the other work we're seeing done across our grasslands. All right, Brenda and some others have asked, because we are part of Project Coyote, and so we talk about coyotes and wolves a lot. And so they wanted to know if you could talk some about bison interactions with wolves and the role that wolves may play in American Prairie's work.
Right. We are very pro-wolf. However, we do not have any wolves. They, as most people know, they are very persecuted. And it's no different here in Montana than anywhere else. And we work, we have a program called Wild Sky. It is a wildlife friendly ranching program where ranchers are incentivized for social acceptance of wildlife, and wolves are one of those species. However, we have a dozen ranches in that program, so we're getting started, but it's going to take 100 ranches to really start to get these big landscapes where wolves are safe. I think interaction wise, I think what we see right now is the bison move a lot for grazing, but other than that, they're not moving a lot. So I think if we would have predators on the landscape, they're going to move more. They're going to be a little more vigilant and weary of what's going on the landscape. So I think with that heterogeneity we talked about would change. I don't know what it would look like though. But in other places, what we see is generally outside of calving season and deep snow, bison aren't threatened by wolves a ton. It's taken, in Yellowstone National Park, it's taken decades for wolves to figure out how to effectively take down bison on a regular basis. It's the same up in Canada on several bison herds. So I can't really speak to it in our region, but over time, wolves do figure it out, especially in the winter with weaker animals, deeper snow. They can effectively take down bison. It takes a lot of learning, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question. So in your presentation, especially when we were talking about mortality, you talked a bit about you don't interfere unless it's like human caused. And so Pam asked, what are the human caused illnesses that you tend to in the bison herds? Are your herds quarantined for some time before being put into pasture due to the thoughts around maybe brucellosis or other diseases transferred between bison and cattle?
Yeah, so yes, we have a very rigid disease testing protocol. We have a quarantine facility that any new bison brought in are brought there first. They are disease tested before they are integrated into the herd. There are a ton of diseases, viruses, other things that are present on the landscape. Elk have them, deer have them. EHD and blue tongue are the most common ones that people have heard of before. Cattle have them. And so in general, most diseases bison are very tolerant of, and they are present on the landscape. The one big disease of concern in the bison world right now is Mycoplasma bovis. It's a respiratory disease. What they're seeing is in herds that get it and have a stressor, whether that's drought or handling them, they're seeing up to 50% mortality in those bison herds with mycoplasma. So there is very little resistance to it. And there's a lot of research happening right now in the bison world, especially I believe at South Dakota State on this because it is so concerning, especially for conservation herds and production herds for that matter. So other than that, there's not a lot we need to worry about. We source from brucellosis free herds. We test for brucellosis regularly. There's none in the region. Yellowstone is the closest place, the only reservoir of brucellosis really in the United States. So as long as we stay away from there, we're pretty safe.
All right. Well, thanks, Scott, for joining us. Thank you to everyone who joined our presentation today and everyone who's joined all of those before. Just want to let everyone know that our last webinar in this Connect the Heartland series is going to be on August 24th, and we're going to be talking about wolves in the Great Lakes region. Our speaker is one of our science advisory members, and he has spent a quarter of a decade or more studying wolves in the Great Lakes, particularly Isle Royale, where we see all kinds of really great interactions. You can sign up for that by going to heartlandrewilding.org /events. Scroll down on the page. For some reason, it doesn't sort by date. We're working on that. And then again, just last reminder that this webinar is going to be uploaded to our YouTube sometime in the next week. Once we have that recording and we have our follow-up blog to answer, there are so many questions we couldn't get to. So we're going to try and get those answered in a blog. And we're going to send an email to everybody with those links. Again, if you want to stay up to date with Heartland Rewilding, what we're doing, and all of our events, you can follow us on Facebook at Heartland Rewilding, on Instagram at Rewilding the Heartland. Our other name was already taken, and at YouTube at Heartland Rewilding to get notifications for this webinar, for all of our events and all of our news. So thanks, everybody. See you next time.